Hello, today I'll be presenting the case R versus Nixon. I'll talk about the role of the prosecutor and ethics in criminal law as pertains to this case. I will start by giving an overview of the facts of the case, then I'll talk about the ethical dilemmas that arise, as well as give a court analysis of those ethical issues, and then present some questions for reflection. So let's begin with the facts. Miss Nixon is a woman who was facing serious charges. She was facing dangerous driving causing death, dangerous driving causing bodily harm, and many other infractions related to impaired driving. She left a woman and her husband dead and a child orphaned and injured. So it was a very devastating situation all around. But then here's where it gets interesting. The Crown decided to enter into a plea agreement with Miss Nixon. They felt they didn't have enough evidence to secure a conviction of her on her part, so they offered her a deal, which was if she pled guilty to a lesser charge of careless driving, she would just pay a fine of $1,800 and she would be let off. So this was considered to be an easy way out for a very serious crime, which is where the ethical dilemmas come in place. So not everyone was on board with this deal because, of course, it was out of the ordinary. Uh, an assistant district attorney, he took a closer look at the case and he was shocked by the court's ruling. He felt that letting Miss Nixon off on such a light conviction would undermine the justice system and it would disrupt public trust and public interest. He also believed that there was enough evidence to convict Miss Nixon, and the Crown hadn't properly prosecuted her. They gave her this plea as a way out, but they should have prosecuted her correctly for the charge. So of course, Miss Nixon was upset when the Crown decided to take back the deal after the district attorney came out and said this. She felt like they were going back on their word. And listen, for her, she was given a way out. She was super happy about the deal. And then all of a sudden, it was taken away from her. So that's an ethical dilemma in itself because she felt like she was let down by the legal system. And she she questioned the validity of giving her this plea agreement if it was going to be taken back. So let's unpack the ethical dilemmas and questions that are raised in R versus Nixon. So first, we have the issue of whether revoking the plea agreement was an abuse of power. So Miss Nixon believes it's an abuse of power. This is what she's arguing because from her perspective, it seemed unfair to accept the deal and then have it taken away from her later on. It's for her, it was like entering into a contract that was a two-way contract and then backing out. So she felt that when she was told she was going to was not guilty and then they were revoked, that it was a breach of contract, and obviously that's the outcome of that is very disappointing to her because she will face those charges and not just have that fine that was given to her. So here's the twist. We need to consider the broader question, which is prosecutional discretion, right? So, does the prosecutor have that discretion to go back and change the plea agreement? Does he have that discretion to revoke the deal? And not at the cost of another person's individual rights. If the main issue here is they were saying that the judge who gave the Crown prosecutor who gave Miss Nixon the choice to accept the plea agreement, he made a mistake. He didn't do his job properly. Does that consist? Is that an abuse of power that now they're revoking his plea agreement, or is that just a proper way of doing things in the justice system when a judge makes a mistake that have it retried and have it fixed? But amongst these legal complexities, we can't forget about Miss Nixon because she's a person who has right to know what's the decision that was behind this, and taking telling someone that they are not guilty and then all of a sudden telling them that they're guilty. This is like kind of like a breach of promise, and for her that infringes on her rights and her liberties. So it is a really big ethical dilemma, which brings us to these are the ethical questions that were raised, which I had just spoken about. But it brings us to a bigger theme, which is balancing the prosecutor's discretion and individual rights, as I just explained. Those are two concepts: the prosecutor's discretion to revoke the plea and change the outcome of Ms. Nixon's case, and individual rights that are pertaining to Ms. Nixon herself and her right to freedom and not being declared guilty when she was told that she wasn't. So, the exercise of discretion has to be balanced with the individual rights of the accused, because this is fair treatment, and you're supposed to have the right, you're supposed to have this freedom and liberty to have your agreements upheld. And Miss Nixon, she should have had that when she agreed to the plea agreement. It should have been kept, maintained, and ultimately, this is not fair for her, and it's not fair to the justice system, because now we are saying anyone who is not found guilty could be found guilty afterwards. So, but then when we consider the prosecutor's actions and weighing that with the individual rights of Miss Nixon, we have to still take into consideration, like I spoke about before, the fact that the court is allowed to make a mistake. Not everyone is perfect, not everyone is human. They're allowed to make mistakes. And let's say Miss Nixon was entered into a plea agreement and really in this case, her it wasn't fair to some people, to the public, that she those convictions were so big and all she got was a small fine. So that's how it disrupts the justice system, because people who have big crimes, that committed big crimes, are getting small um, convictions and are getting out, whereas people who are committing small crimes might not necessarily have the same be in the same situation. So initially, the discretion that the prosecutor had was that open. Um, he had that open discretion to decide what he was going to present to Miss Nixon as her plea agreement, and he decided it would be $1,800. So that was his discretion. And is that in the public's best interest? No. But again, a judge has this kind of discretion. So we have to balance that, because the judge is an officier of the justice, and he has a word, he has a discretion. So we can't completely take that away from the judge. But in the end, we have to consider the individual person's rights and what's fair and what's not fair. So this is a huge ethical dilemma that is presented in this case, and one that arises many questions, many different answers. I don't think necessarily there is a right from wrong, but I do think that in this case, it is important to take a step back and say, listen, on one side, this person committed a very big crime. They killed two people, there's a kid who's orphan. So I think it is ethical to go back on the decision of the judge and say, listen, that's not right. We need to fix that for the bigger public interest. There's Miss Nixon's rights, but then there's equality and bigger public interest, because if we started to take that as a precedent, then it could become a very bad precedent for next cases that are similar to Miss Nixon. So again, another issue is not just balancing the discretion of the judge, but balancing individual and societal concerns. Like I just touched on, it's a bigger problem because we don't want to set a precedent for other people and for society that this is the norm, that we could just allow a conviction that was wrongfully done to continue to be upheld at the expense, because we don't want to infringe on someone's liberty, individual liberty. It's a very complicated issue. It's a very complicated issue, but the court approaches it in this way. So before assessing a situation, they think about abuse of power, and there's two key interests in the context of abuse of power: the prosecutor, his discretion, and the process itself. Is the process itself abusive? So if it's two different things, so they could determine that the prosecutor's decision was abusive or that the process itself was abusive. And this would be, for example, to revoke the deal. This would be the analysis that the court will have to make. You have to see if the judge acted within the bounds and within his discretion, because a judge's discretion is not huge. We cannot. So that's what I talk when we're talking about balancing the discretion of the judge and society and individual rights. We have to also limit the scope of the judge's discretion so that it is not huge. A judge has to follow certain norms, of society, has to follow certain rules of like laws, and cannot just make a decision based on what they think is would help one person, or what, like, it can't just be on the fly. It has to be a detailed decision. That's why judges write judgments. It has to be super organized and super concise so that there's no problems like in Miss Nixon's case where people are questioning the original judgment. If a judgment is correctly done to begin with, it will not be questioned later on, and that's why a judge can't have that much discretion. Need to limit the scope of that. I want to touch on maintaining public trust in the system, because if we take Miss Nixon now, she has obviously no more trust in the system because she was saying, hey, here's a deal to get out of your conviction, accept it. She did accept it, and then they came back to her and they went back on the deal. So for her confidence in the justice system is little to none. She's questioning why they went back on the decision and how that affects her rights as an individual, because she was literally told that she was not guilty, and then she was told she was guilty. So now I'm going to give my thoughts on the case. I just spoke about how Miss Nixon would feel, and I truly believe that if I was in Miss Nixon's shoes, I would feel the same way, because I would feel as if I was let down by the justice system and I was kind of made a fool of, because how would I know if I could trust a judge's word or the system's word or the process itself? I would consider it abusive as well, because how is one judge's word overturned by another one who believes other, like, different than the first one? There needs to be some sort of process, some sort of organized structure. So this is what I would believe if I was in Miss Nixon's case. I do believe though that many prosecutors do make mistakes, so there is supposed to be a review of cases to prevent such mistakes. I do think that letting Miss Nixon off on a smaller charge is against societal interests, because I already touched on this, but it would just create a negative precedent for future cases. And the child left orphaned by Miss Nixon, we can't just like forget about him, we can't forget about the two people that were dead. We just can't forget about it. It's not something that can go away on $1,800 fine. So plea agreements, the court said they could be retried in exceptional circumstances, and they did believe that this was not an abuse of power, but it was one of these exceptional circumstances. I believe that revoking convictions, revoking plea deals and agreements should be there should be a process for that, where it could only be done in rare circumstances and well justified circumstances. And that's why I think it is really important, one, to limit the discretion of a judge, and two, also to establish the fact that a judge, when he renders his decision, it needs to be super clear, super concise, super, like, all of his reasoning needs to be compiled in that decision, so that a person like Miss Nixon can read it and say, okay, yes, I am guilty, or okay, no, I am not guilty. Just not simply just offering someone a plea deal and say take it or leave it. It needs to be, like, written down, concise, and it so that it cannot be revoked and it cannot be retried, and that would just stabilize the justice system completely in a case like Miss Nixon's. So this is what I think about R versus Nixon and the ethical issues that it's raised. I think these are big, important issues, and I thank you today for listening to my presentation.